children. I have a story for you today that comes from this book. It's a German folk tale, and it comes from a book called The Pink Fairy Book. This is a collection of stories that were gathered together in the late 19th century by a man named Andrew Lang. He was a folklorist, and he collected stories because he was afraid that if they weren't written down, people would lose them forever. And this particular story is called The Goblin and the Grocer. Do you have a goblin living in your house? You might not know whether you do or whether you don't, but if you do, I hope you treat him properly, because a goblin who is treated well and treated respectfully brings good luck to the household. There were once a student, a grocer, the grocer's wife, and a goblin. They all lived together in the same house that belonged to the grocer. He was very well off. The student lived in a garret or an attic, up at the very top of the house. He lived there because he was poor. He worked very hard studying his books, but he really didn't have 2 cents to rub together. The grocer and his wife lived on the second floor of the house. That was where their apartment was, and the grocer's store was downstairs on the street level. The grocer's store was like any shop. It had a cash till and a coffee mill. It had a set of scales, a spool of string, and paper for wrapping up people's parcels. The goblin. I haven't forgotten about the goblin. The goblin could live anywhere he liked, but he chose to stay with the grocer because every Christmas, the grocer would leave something special on the counter for him. He would leave a big dish of jam with a large lump of the best butter in the middle. It was the goblin's favorite thing. The grocer could well afford it, and so the goblin was very, very loyal to the grocer. One day, the student came into the shop to buy a candle and a piece of cheese. While the grocer wrapped his purchases, the student chatted with the grocer's wife. And when his parcel was handed over to him, the student glanced down at it, and then he stopped still. His parcel was wrapped in a page torn from an old book, and printed on the page was a poem. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Oh, that," said the grocer. "That's a book that an old lady came in yesterday. She traded it to me in exchange for some coffee. The rest of it's down there on the counter. If you want it, you can have it for $1. Well, the student was very poor. He didn't have another dollar, and so he handed back the cheese. "I'll take the book. You keep the cheese," he said. "My bread will taste fine without cheese, but it would be a shame to see the book damaged any further." "You know," he said to the grocer, "you're a very clever and practical fellow, my friend, but you have no more poetry in you than that old tub full of newspapers over in the corner." And then the two of them laughed, for they knew it was a joke. But the tub felt insulted. He was sure he should take offense. And as for the goblin who'd overheard this, well, he was furious. No one should speak of his grocer in such a way. That night, when the shop was closed, the goblin crept up to the grocer's bedroom, and he borrowed the grocer's wife's tongue. She used it well enough during the day. Oh my, she could talk the ear off a donkey, but she had no need of her tongue when she was asleep. For you see, the goblin had the power. He had the power of putting that tongue on any object that he wished, and then it could speak its thoughts and feelings just as well as the grocer's wife herself. But he could only put it on one thing at a time. So he started with the tub, and he asked it, "Is it really true that you have no poetry in you at all?" "Why," said the tub, It certainly isn't true. I'm most offended at the idea. Why, I am full of newspapers, and everyone knows that the newspapers are full of poetry. People read it and quote it, and they clip the poems out to save. I have more poetry in me than that grocer, maybe even more poetry than the student himself. Then the goblin took the tongue, and he set it on the coffee mill, and then on the scales, and then on the cash till, and every one of them said the same thing. That tub was a veritable repository of poetry. He was full of poetry. They all agreed, and as we know, the majority are always right. And so the goblin decided that he would go upstairs, and he would assure that student that he was mistaken. But as he climbed the stairs, he saw that there was a light just glowing underneath the student's door. And so instead of bursting right in, he stood on his tiptoes and he put his eye to the keyhole. And what a sight he saw. It just took his breath away. The student was sitting at his desk with the poetry book open in front of him. A shaft of light streamed from the book, and in that shaft of light, the most beautiful tree stretched its branches wide until they filled the whole room. Every leaf on the tree was glowing and alive. Every flower on the tree was a girl's face, some of them with flashing dark eyes, others with calm blue eyes. All of the fruit on the tree was a precious jewel, glistening and glowing in bright colors like a glittering star. The room was filled with the most marvelous music and the perfume of rain-drenched blossoms. The goblin was transfixed. He had never seen anything like it. In fact, he had never dreamed that such a marvelous sight could possibly exist. He stayed with his eye pressed against the keyhole until at last the student closed the book. The light faded, and the music gently died away as it lulled the student to sleep. The goblin thought to himself, whoever knew such splendid sights existed? Why, perhaps I should come and stay with the student. But then he thought some more. No, the grocer is the one with the jam. I should stay with the grocer. And then he hurried back downstairs, where he rescued the tongue. It was just about worn out with talking, for the tub had been reading pieces of information from the newspapers the whole time he was gone. And now he was considered the authority on everything, from the news of the day to the theater reviews to the Business Digest. Everyone thought that that tub was the font of all knowledge, except for the goblin. He found he could no longer stay down in the grocery shop after things closed. He couldn't stand to listen to all of the high-browed conversation that was going on down there. No, he felt as though he was pulled up the stairs to the attic by strong, invisible ropes. And when he got there, he would press his eye to the keyhole, and the most wonderful feelings washed over him. Sometimes he felt as though he was sailing on a stormy, rolling sea, and other times he was climbing a high mountain up into the clouds. Oh, it was so exhilarating. Other times he felt a great sadness wash over him, and other times he laughed and wept tears of joy. It was the most magical experience, and he thought how wonderful it must be to sit with the student under that beautiful tree. But the goblin couldn't quite go that far. He still felt loyal to the grocer, and so he had to consent himself with putting his eye to the keyhole. and he went up the stairs to the garret every night, all through the autumn and on into the winter. And just about this time of year, he discovered that as he left, the walls of the passageway up the stairs were covered with ice crystals, and the wind was whistling through the cracks. But he didn't notice any of that while his eye was pressed close to the keyhole. It was only when he turned away that he realized he was stiff and frozen and shivering, and he was glad to get back down to his cozy corner in the grocer's shop. Christmas Eve came, and as he always did, the grocer left out on the counter a big dish of jam with a big lump of butter for the goblin. But a couple of nights later, the whole house, in fact the whole street, was wakened by a tremendous clamor. There was shouting in the street and ringing of bells. People were pounding on the shutters of the house. There was a fire in the street. No one knew which house was afire, and so everyone hurried to save something that they valued. The grocer's wife took her earrings off and put them in her pocket for safekeeping. The grocer seized his account books, and the maid saved her best black silk dress that she wore on Sundays. The goblin realized what he must do. He knew what the most valuable possession in the house was, and he hurried up the stairs. He burst into the student's room in the attic. The student was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the fire and all the commotion in the street. The book was sitting on the table. The goblin seized hold of it. He wrapped it up in his red stocking cap, and he clutched it to his chest. And then he climbed out on the roof, where he too could watch the fire and the fire engines throwing water on the blaze. And as he sat there, he thought. He realized where his heart truly lay. The most precious possession in the house had been saved. It was the book of poetry. And he knew that, loyal as he was to the grocer, he truly loved the student and his book. And he thought, and he thought. And then the goblin decided that he would divide his time. He would spend half of his time with the student, because he had the beautiful book of poetry with all its adventures and wonders. But he would spend the other half of the time with the grocer, because the grocer had the jam and he sold the best butter. As I was getting ready to come to the library today, I realized that I knew a little poem, and it might be the sort of poem that made the goblin think that he was sailing on a rolling, stormy sea, or going off to exotic places. I haven't learned the poem by heart, but it's a poem that was written by a Canadian poet named Bliss Carman, who wrote his poems at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. It's a poem called the Ships of Yule, and as you probably know, Yule is another word for Christmas. So perhaps some of these were the boats and ships that the boy received as Christmas presents. The Ships of Yule. When I was just a little boy, before I went to school, I had a fleet of 40 sail I called the Ships of Yule. Of every rig, from rakish brig and gallant barkentine to little funny fishing boats with gunnels painted green. They used to go on trading trips around the world for me, for though I had to stay on shore, my heart was on the sea. They stopped at every port of call, from Babylon to Rome, to load with all the lovely things we never had at home, with elephants and ivory bought from the king of Tyre, and shells and silk and sandalwood that sailor men admire, with figs and dates from Samarkand, and squatty ginger jars, and scented silver amulets from Indian bazaars, with sugar cane from Port of Spain, and monkeys from Ceylon, and paper lanterns from Peking with painted dragons on, with coconuts from Zanzibar and pines from Singapore. And when they had unloaded these, they could go back for more. And even after I was big and had to go to school, my mind was often far away, aboard the ships of Yule. I hope all of you have a Merry Christmas and a happy holiday, and that we all have a safe and healthy New Year.